So why investigate the Burren? So it's a landscape that's been exploited since the Neolithic, and both the archaeological record and previous pollen studies that have been done in the area attest to its importance in prehistory. Previous studies, however, have been confined to really small lake basins, so Loch Inchquin provided the opportunity to look at the pollen at a broader scale, so to see what was going on across a wider region of the Burren. So Loch Inchquin is just here on the map, and then this black outline is the estimated catchment area. So generally, the larger the lake, the bigger the pollen catchment will be. And you can see these little dots and triangles and things inside there. There are all these different archaeological sites. So we have wedge tombs and we have enclosures and things. And these also extend further to the north as well, you can see. Investigations like this can take advantage of the continuous record provided by lake sediments. So they essentially act as an archive of environmental change. So sediment accumulation is generally a constant process, so you get this stratigraphic sequence of different environmental indicators, including pollen. So this is in contrast to the normal archaeological record, which can be episodic, and it can contain biases of preservation. So for example, the monuments of earlier prehistory dominate the Burren landscape. The use of pollen analysis then can help us to develop our understandings of the prehistory of this region and then fill in any gaps in our interpretations. So before I go into the results, I'm just going to cover some of the very basics of each technique that we used so that everything makes a bit more sense. So pollen is produced annually into the atmosphere. It all gets mixed up and then eventually gets deposited within a context. So this might be in a peat bog or a lake. So this image here is Loch Inchquin. So it's just demonstrating that pollen can come from close by to the lakeside, but it can also come over a greater distance as well. So you get this mix of local and more regional pollen coming in. The sediments in the lake are anaerobic, so we have these waterlogged conditions, so the pollen can survive for thousands of years. The outer walls of the grains are made up of a polymer called sporopollenin, which is where it gets its name from, and this can withstand most forms of degradation. So then we can come along and we can take a core of the lake sediment to analyze the pollen that's within it. And pollen data can tell us a number of different things about the vegetation. So we can look at whether there was woodland clearance happening, and we can look at pastoral and arable farming. And importantly, we can look at the timing of these changes, so the timing of environmental change. So there are certain species that thrive in disturbed environments. So Plantago lanceolata, that's ribwort plantain down here, this is our most important anthropogenic indicator. So when we see this alongside a suite of other pastoral taxa, so all the things that you'd find in a modern day meadow, this suggests to us that there is land disturbance and associated human activity. And then when we see that together with a big decrease in tree pollen, we call that a landnam. So this is when people were coming along and they were clearing the landscape of trees, and then you get these pasture lands developing. And then for the arable farming, we can identify cereal type grains. So these are some examples here. So these are quite characteristic. They're a lot larger than other grains, and they have this really distinctive paw in the middle. And sometimes you can also identify arable weeds as well, so other plants that might be growing with their crops. All of these have a low dispersal capacity, so the pollen doesn't get very far away from the actual plant itself. So they can be quite underrepresented in pollen records, but if you're trying to link it with the archaeology and look at the human activity, it's important to try and zone in on these. So this is just looking at the chironomid analysis. So chironomids are non-biting midgeflies, so you often see big swarms of them at the lake edges, are the ones that kind of float around a bit. But it's actually the head capsules of the larvae that we use for the analysis. So the larvae live within the lake, and at various stages in their life cycle, they shed their head capsules. So these are some examples here under the microscope. So these black bits are actually their teeth. So that's how we identify different types. And you get a really high abundance of these in all lake sediments. So they're handy because they're stenotopic, which means that certain species can only live in certain environments. And they're also really sensitive to environmental change as well. So they can tell us a bit about the conditions within the lake at different times. Traditionally, they were used for climate studies, but it's actually been shown that land use is a more determining factor in what species will be present within a lake. So in Ireland, there's been studies done, and there are particular taxa that have been linked to pastoral agriculture. So combined with the chironomid analysis, we also did some organic and inorganic geochemistry. So we analysed the amount of nitrogen-15 that was within the sediments. So nitrogen becomes increased in lakes that are surrounded by agricultural catchments. So you have lots of pastoral farming happening. So this is because the inwash of manure or soil erosion that's caused by disturbing the land is causing the lake to become more nutrient enriched. So we get the eutrophication of the lake system. And then we also looked at a whole range of different elements using XRF, and 4 of these were shown to be significant. And of these, we zoned in on titanium because that's been used in previous studies as an indicator of soil erosion. So we were able to look a little bit at the weathering of catchment soils. So this is just looking at Loch Inchquin. So I'm sure a few of you are familiar with this. So 2 kilometers northwest of Corofin. It was chosen both due to its large size, so it's around 110 hectares, but also its proximity to all this archaeology on the southern Burren. So of particular interest is Rowan Hill, so that's only 3 kilometers to the north of the lake. The River Fergus also rises to the south of Rowan Hill and runs into the lake. So not only do you get this regional pollen signal because of the size, but there's also pollen that's been drained from across the Burren Plateau, and it's been brought into the lake with the river. So it's around 30 meters deep, and the catchment area that you saw on the previous map is estimated to be just over 93 kilometers squared. So back in June 2015, we extracted a core from the lake. So we have this equipment here. It's a piston core, and it's attached to this metal raft that floats. So we basically have to get this in position on the lake. So we aim to core in the deepest part of the lake. So if you imagine all the sediments and things are swirling around, and they all kind of settle in the middle. So basically, once we are in position, we then lowered down 30 meters of metal casing. So that kind of created a tunnel we did it down this hole. So it goes from the bottom of the raft to the lake bed. So it creates like a tunnel, and then we can drive the coring equipment down through that. And then we push it down through the lake sediment, and it can extract 2 meters at a time. And then this gets extruded with this little contraption at the lake edge. So this is basically all of the sediment that we got from Loch Inchquin. So we got over 10.5 meters. So the red outline, so this bit here is the bit that I analysed. So this runs from the Mesolithic up to the early Iron Age. But it is a full sequence. So you'd have the modern stuff here and the medieval, and then this goes right back to the glacial clay. And we think that's the deepest core ever taken in Ireland through the 30 meters of water. So we're kind of pushing the equipment to its limits, really. So I did pollen analysis on 90 samples, and I count 1,000 grains per sample, so it's over 90,000 pollen grains. And this is the diagram that shows the percentage data. So basically the blue is the trees, and then we have shrubs and ferns. This green section is all these pastoral indicators I was talking about. Then we have cereals, bog taxa, and then aquatic taxa, so things that are actually growing in the lake. So this on the left here is a composite. So basically when the blue is the highest, that means we have woodland. And then when the green starts to come up, this is when we have an expansion of this grassland or pasture land. But these diagrams are kind of horrible. They're really hard to read, especially on screens like this. So for the results, I've done like pie charts that will hopefully be easier to see the overall trends in the landscape. But it's just important for when you're looking at the pie charts, that's like an average of the percentages over that entire time period, so you don't get such big peaks and things. So into the results. So the profile for Loch Inchquin opens in the late Mesolithic, so around 4,600 BC. So you can see that it's mostly a wooded environment. We have this mixed deciduous woodland. The main tall canopy tree would have been oak, and then you would have had elm and pine as well. And then hazel would have been an important understory component. So these are some examples of the pollen. So this is an oak pollen, that's elm and pine. So some of them can be quite distinctive. This is hazel here. And then we have a rise in alder. So this is the alder pollen at around 4,300 BC, which marks the boreal to Atlantic transition. So the succession of kind of woodland. The early Neolithic was when people really started to have a significant influence on their environment. So the elm decline occurred around 4060 BC, and this is something that's seen across Ireland at this time and was likely a result of disease and climate, as well as these early beginnings of human activity. So you can see that the amount of pastoral land has increased here, and we actually have a landnam that spans for 5 centuries. So trees were cleared from the landscape to make way for these species-rich grasslands. So we had the clearance of elm, oak, and hazel from the woodlands. And then in the grasslands, we had all these kind of meadow species that you'd get today. So grasses, ribwort plantain, dock, buttercup, things like that. And we also have the first cereal type pollen identified. So there was some small-scale arable agriculture occurring at this time. So in terms of the archaeology, when we have this landnam phase of early farming, we have early activity at portal tombs. So Ballycasheen is a ruined example close by to Loch Inchquin, but then I'm not sure you're all familiar with Polnaroan, which is just outside the catchment, but just to the north. We also have activity on Rowan Hill as well, with the construction of these court tombs. So this is Pacnabinia court tomb, which is around 3,700 BC. During the middle and into the late Neolithic, we actually get a period of woodland regeneration. So from around 3,550 BC, we have this woodland again, made up of elm and oak, and then you'd have hazel and alder in the understory. And we actually get 2 new tree species in the Burren at this time. So we have an expansion of ash and yew, and these both become established from around 3,200 BC. So both this woodland recovery and this expansion of these 2 new species is something that we see across Ireland and into Britain as well in the Middle Neolithic. So this is an example of one of the ash pollen, and this is yew pollen here. So while we have this wooded landscape again, we get the construction of the Pullowack Lincolnstown Kist around 3,350 BC. And we also have continued deposition at Pacnabinia Court Tomb and at Polnaroan. So this graph is just showing that we had an overlapping use of 3 different monuments on the Burren at this time when there was more of a wooded environment. We also have a date of 3080 BC from a habitation site at Teesca. So this graph is showing all the combined data that we have. So it's looking at the pollen and then combining the chironomids and the geochemistry and everything to take a look at the actual lake system. So here is our landnam. So this is when we get this early Neolithic farming. And at the same time of that, we get an increase in the nitrogen. So there's a slight response, slight nutrient enrichment of the lake from that farming activity. The chironomids are all oligotrophic, so they're showing that there isn't that much nutrient enrichment occurring. So it's really just the natural state of the lake at this time. Tree clearance begins again from around 2850 BC, which allows grasslands to become established once more across the southern Burren landscape. So again, we have grasses, ribwort plantain, dock, buttercups, etc. And this again is a trend that we see across Ireland. So we have this middle Neolithic woodland, and then people come in again and start farming again. We also have some arable components as well at this time. So this is one of the cereal grains that was found at Loch Inchgwyn from this time. Known activity within the catchment is concentrated at the Páirc na Bíniú Court Tomb, where Chamber 2 was blocked, but we still get deposition into Chamber 1 until 2770 BC. So then when we come into the Chalcolithic, we get the further expansion of pasture land. So there would have been more open areas now across the southern Burren, and these would have been being used more intensively. So at this time, woodland clearance seems to target oak and alder, and we also get a second elm decline, but that again may have things to do with disease and climate as well as this activity. For the first time, we get significant levels of bracken. So this is the spore from the bracken fern, and that's known to colonize newly cleared areas. So that's hinting again at this opening up of new parts of the land. We also have higher cereal pollen at this time, so arable agriculture is becoming a bit more intensive. So we have this mixed farming. And these again are just some examples of these pastoral indicators. So that's the ribwort plantain pollen, grass, daisy, dock, dandelion, and buttercup. So. There's definitely an increased visibility of archaeological remains from the Chalcolithic. So we have the densest concentration of wedge tombs in the country in the Burren. 15 of those are on Rowan Hill, and then we have more at Ballygana and in the Pulnabrone Depression as well. So a few of these have been excavated recently by the Irish Field School of Prehistoric Archaeology, which some of you might be familiar with. So this is during the excavations of the Páirc na Bíniú wedge tomb. And then there was another one kind of across the fields for that. So I was involved with digging the chamber for that one, which was good fun. And they also excavated a barrow on Knockloon Hill, where they found cremations from this period as well. So there's lots of funerary evidence from this period. An intensification of this mixed farming occurred from around 1810 BC. So you can see from the pie chart, this pasture land again has increased quite significantly. We also have more intensive arable agriculture happening at this time, which would have been on suitable soils. Interestingly, at this time we have a small peak in freshwater algae. So this is an example here of an algae pediastrum. So that's hinting from the pollen data that we're getting increased nutrients within the lake. So we can take a better look at that once we look at the combined data. On Rowan Hill, we have a system of 4 habitation sites and field systems, which extend over 370 acres. So this is contemporaneous with this intensification of farming. So this is a map of all these field systems with the little habitation sites. So that dates from around 2300 to 1550 BC. So it corresponds really well with this big peak in activity we get from the pollen data. And because of the closeness of Rowan Hill, it's likely that activity there is actually reflected in the pollen record. And we also have similar evidence elsewhere at Teesca and at Coolnatulla as well. So we can perhaps think of this period as a distinct farming phase in the southern Burren, and that's being demonstrated both through the archaeological record and the pollen data. So this is coming back to this graph again, which combines everything about the lake. So we're in this period from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. So this is this increasing mixed farming that's occurring here. So this is the pastoral and that's the cereals. And you can see again that the nitrogen is increasing again. So that's showing that the lake is becoming more nutrient enriched. As I said, this is contemporary with this Rowan Hill settlement activity. And from those excavations, we have evidence of cattle, sheep, and pig bones. So it's looking like a really strong pastoral economy on the Burren at that time, although we do have evidence for some cereal growing as well. The chironomids have responded to this nutrient enrichment, so now we get different species present within the lake. So that's showing that there's some lake eutrophication. We also have some species that are linked to the influx of sandy sediments. So this is interesting because during this period we get this big peak in titanium. You can see here. So this reaches a maximum by 2480 BC, and it starts rising from the late Neolithic. So it's looking like we have significant erosion of soils on the Burren occurring from the late Neolithic through to the early Bronze Age. So after this intensive farming phase, we again get some more woodland regeneration. This is more obvious in the actual composite from the diagram. So you can see this is the early Bronze Age peak here, and then it drops down and we get more woodland occurring. The start of this woodland recovery is the end of the use of the Rowan Hill settlement sites. So it's quite interesting. It looks like a lot of the pollen is coming from that activity at that site. So this time there would have been widespread hazel woodland, and we also start to see elm coming back, as well as ivy and holly as well. But there is still some evidence for small-scale pastoral and arable farming, but it might be that that's now occurring further away from the lake itself. So in terms of the archaeology, at Glencurran Cave, so this is 6 kilometers north of the lake, we have a phase of ritual activity. So this is a cairn that was discovered inside, which was associated with human bones and rich artifacts like these amber beads here. There may also have been some modification of the wedge tombs on Rowan Hill. This is a secondary inhumation, so these are some human bones here that were found buried within the cairn material, which date to this period. And we also have 2 phases of burial at the Pulluwack Kist as well. So we have burial evidence, and in terms of settlement, it's likely that some of the burnt mounds that are spread across this landscape would have dated to this period. So we only have one excavated example, but that dates to 1408 to 1219 BC. So it's likely that probably more of those date to this period. So from the late Bronze Age, we identified a significant landnam that spanned for 500 years. So woodland was cleared, and there was targeted clearance of hazel as well for the first time. So people were now intensively farming the landscape of the southern Burren, both for pastoral and arable agriculture. In the middle of this period, there was a century where this declined a little bit, and we got some woodland regeneration, but then again, that was subsequently cleared. So we had particularly intense periods in the 12th century BC and the 9th century BC. So in terms of the archaeology, there are late Bronze Age dates at the Teesca habitation site, and also Enclosure 1 on the Carron Plateau. So they both date to this landnam phase. So they're indicating settlement and farming activity. At Glencurran Cave, we have another phase of ritual activity. So there were a number of individuals found, again associated with late Bronze Age artifacts, like these little shells. And one of these burials was dated to 800 to 730 BC. So their burial dates to the second peak of the landnam. We have evidence again much further north outside of the catchment at Turlock Hill, where we have these hut sites that date to the late Bronze Age. And then there are artifacts and things that have been found as well, such as the Glenishean Gorget. So this graph is now looking at this last period here. So this is the big landnam. So you can see it's much more intensive than the previous periods. and has much more cereal as well. So at this point, the nitrogen is at its highest, and we did carry it on up to the more modern material, and it basically stays at this level. So it gets quite enriched with all these nutrients. It's also demonstrated in the presence of aquatic plants and algae. So this is the algae Pediastrum and an aquatic plant. So these increase as well. So the lake's becoming much more productive. Animal manure is enriched in nitrogen. So you can imagine if there were a lot of cows, for example, in the immediate landscape, this would have had an impact on the lake system. So these are some examples of the chironomids from this period. So these are now eutrophic taxa. So they can only live in a really productive lake. So they've responded to these increased nutrients. And then again, if we look at the levels of the titanium, which we were using as an indicator of soil erosion, these have come really down. So this significant soil erosion that we got in the previous period isn't continuing now. So this is showing the enrichment of the lake system. So we did some statistics to look further into the effect of farming activity and soil erosion on the chironomids. So the chironomids are basically acting as this proxy for environmental change within the lake. So basically this statistics, it spreads out all of our samples. And then we have two arrows. So this is the titanium in this direction, and then the nitrogen in this direction. So if we take these black circle samples, so these are our samples from the Mesolithic. So when we had this natural lake system and it hadn't been influenced by human activity yet. So basically, once, statistics are hard, but once you apply them, it basically shows that the samples that are influenced by these two vectors, these two arrows, will move towards them. So these black squares are the late Bronze Age samples when we have the landnam. So they've all moved over towards the nitrogen arrow, which shows that nitrogen is the main influence on them. So because of the large size of Loch Inchquin, for it to become so nutrient enriched suggests that it was very intensive farming. So perhaps in this period, there was an increased herd size if we're talking about cattle. And definitely the activity was local to the lakeside. So you can imagine the immediate landscape around Loch Inchquin would have been used for pastoral farming. And then our other major finding was this detection of soil erosion from the Burren uplands, starting in the late Neolithic and continuing until at least 1700 BC. So again, on the graph here, you can see the samples are clustering towards this titanium arrow. So it's the titanium that is having an influence on the samples in this period. Burren soils would have been quite fragile, so that might explain why erosion occurred so early on in the farming regime here. There is previous evidence of erosion across the Burren. So this was found in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age at Molly's Loch, which is a really small lake next to Loch Inchquin. We have late Bronze Age evidence of erosion on Knockhanes Mountain and some other mountains as well. And there's also evidence from caves across the Burren as well. And again, because Loch Inchquin is so big and so deep, for erosion to register so strongly, it must have been quite significant. So to conclude everything up, so we were able to demonstrate the changing intensity of farming activity going from the early Neolithic through to the late Bronze Age. The late Bronze Age was identified as the period with the most intensive agriculture, and the impact on the lake system itself suggests that this included localized grazing. So that's something that we wouldn't have been able to detect through just conventional archaeology. The sensitivity of the lake system to prehistoric farming, even in a large deep lake, has been shown, with nitrogen and this nutrient enrichment shown to have a really big effect. And then finally, this data provides well-dated evidence for the early erosion of Burren soils in prehistory, which ultimately led to the limestone karst that we see today. So thank you very much.